Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea saw a rise in COVID-19 figures over the weekend, reporting over 10,000 daily cases on Saturday and Sunday. Health authorities are concerned over a resurgence of cases due to waning immunity and eased restrictions. South Korea on Sunday reported its first heat-related death of the year amid scorching temperatures nationwide. According to the Interior Ministry, a man in his 40s was found collapsed while moving farm produce at a farm in South Gyeongsang-do Province on Friday. Russia claims it has fully seized the Ukrainian region of Luhansk after weeks of intense fighting. Ukraine confirmed the loss of Lysychansk, Ukraine's last stronghold in Luhansk, marking a significant victory for Putin 4 months after he launched his invasion.
Hello and welcome to New Day at Arirang. It's Monday, July 4th, 8 a.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. I'm Yoon.
And I'm Yoon. Thanks for joining us this morning because over the next hour, we'll be giving you a look at some of the biggest stories of the day and experts' insights on key issues facing Korea and the rest of the world. Our top story this morning, South Korea is seeing a growing number of COVID-19 infections. Over the weekend, the daily figure both Saturday and Sunday surpassed 10,000.
Now, the number reported on Monday is expected to be lower because we tend to see fewer cases at the beginning of the week, but the COVID number is still expected to be much higher compared to the same day last week. Our Choi Min-jung starts us off.
South Korea is witnessing yet another upward trend in COVID-19 infections. Over the weekend, the country's daily tally surpassed 10,000 for 2 days in a row. Usually, the figure for this period drops as fewer people get tested over the weekend. But these figures signal a change in the trend. And with cases increasing, concerns are mounting over the possibility of another surge.
The number of infections will increase continuously until winter. Given that the BA4 or BA5 strain becomes dominant, we predict at least 150,000 to 200,000 cases will be reported daily. It's possible to see another large-scale infection like we did when the Delta variant was dominant.
The authorities say there are numerous reasons behind the latest surge.
We believe increased indoor activities and people traveling during summer, waning effectiveness of vaccinations, and new strains of COVID-19 are the main causes.
The number of imported cases is also on the rise. Pundits say this is mainly because more people are traveling across borders with eased travel restrictions. In preparation for a potential surge this coming fall, health authorities are gearing up to closely monitor the country's medical system and ensure there are enough hospital beds for those who need them. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Following last week's trip to Madrid for the NATO Summit, President Yoon reflected on his trip focusing primarily on geopolitics and economic cooperation. Our Yoon Jung-min has more.
What President Yoon, now about 2 months in office, felt on his first overseas trip to Spain for last week's NATO summit included the importance of technological cooperation for future growth, according to his spokesperson Kang In-sun, who discussed the president's thoughts on Sunday. Having met nearly 30 world leaders during his 3-day stay in Madrid, Eastern and Northern European countries were much interested in expanding cooperation with Seoul on nuclear energy, green technology, semiconductors, and electric car batteries, fields where they consider South Korea top-notch. According to his spokesperson, President Yoon also said he got a physical sense of the reality of international politics while meeting with world leaders in person. Both Yoon and his counterparts were eager to invite each other to their own countries down the road. Hopes for a greater economic partnership were also echoed in a luncheon with Spanish business people hosted by the South Korean president in Spain, where he pledged to do more so that more Spanish companies can invest in Korea, particularly in renewable energy and other sectors related to the environment.
스페인 경제인 여러분은 이미 한국 기업과 협력하고 있거나 또는 협력 의향을 갖고 계신 것으로 알고 있습니다. 저는 민간 중심의 경제를 늘 강조해 왔고 정부는 기업들이 적극적으로 투자할 수 있는 환경을 조성하기 위해 노력하고 있습니다.
The Spanish business leaders reportedly thanked President Yoon, saying he was the only foreign head of state to meet with them among the world leaders in Madrid for the summit. And meeting Korean nationals in Spain, President Yoon and First Lady Kim Gun-hee were moved to tears listening to a performance by the Spanish choir group Vocal Millennium, who sang Korean songs including Miryang Arirang and Our Wish in perfect Korean. As for behind-the-scenes stories, the top office on Sunday unveiled photos of the president and the first lady enjoying their free time in Spain, taking a walk near their hotel and having ice cream. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
North Korea on Sunday condemned a new agreement between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan to strengthen their military ties, saying it's an American attempt to create an Asian NATO. Earlier in the week, President Yoon met with his American and Japanese counterparts on the sidelines of the NATO Summit to discuss three-way military cooperation. According to North Korea state media, the regime's foreign ministry spokesperson said the move shows Washington's real intention, which North Korea believes is to create an Asian NATO to counter Russia and China. The regime also said it threatens world peace and security.
Now, South Korea's top economic policymakers said Sunday that the government is going to expand its trade financing by about $30 billion from what it had originally planned early in the year. The finance minister Chu Kyung-ho was speaking in the new government's third emergency meeting of economy-related ministers. He also said the government will spare no effort to keep Korea's exports growing. Exports hit an all-time high in the first half of the year, recovering strongly from the impact of the pandemic. But he said it's hard to be optimistic. Growth in the U.S. economy is slowing down and global trade volume is shrinking, so exports could have a rough rest of the year. Now, amid the scorching heat, South Korea has reported its first heat-related death this year. The Interior Ministry says a man in his 40s was found collapsed while moving farm produce at a market in Gyeongsangnam-do province on Friday. He was taken to hospital where he was pronounced dead. The news comes as part of the region's reported the highest temperatures of the year on Sunday, prompting authorities to issue heat wave alerts. They advise special caution for those who are vulnerable to inclement weather, including construction workers, elderly farmers, and senior single-person households. Now, Russian forces claim they have captured Lysychansk in eastern Ukraine, while Ukrainian president says fight for the pivotal city will continue. The news comes as Australia pledges to provide more military support for the war-torn country. Kim Il-sun has more.
The Russian military claims it has taken full control of the Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry said Sunday that the region has been, quote, liberated. This comes as Russian forces say they have captured villages around Lysychansk and encircled the city, which had been the final Ukrainian holdout. Ukraine's military later confirmed that its forces had withdrawn from the city. Addressing the nation, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky acknowledged the withdrawal, but pledged that the city will be retaken with more modern weapons. In related news, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said Sunday, during his visit to Ukraine, that his country will provide additional military support to Ukraine. This includes 34 armored vehicles, a number of drones, and some $68 million.
Australia stands ready to continue to support the government and the people of Ukraine for as long as it takes for Ukraine to emerge victorious in defence of your national sovereignty and your homeland. Because you are fighting for the international rule of law.
He also added that Canberra will be slapping sanctions and travel bans on 16 more Russian ministers and oligarchs, bringing the total number of Russians sanctioned by Australia to more than 840. He also pledged his country would ban Russian gold imports while giving duty-free access to Ukrainian goods. During his visit, the Australian Prime Minister visited war-torn towns of Bucha and Irpin. Kim Il-sun, Arirang News.
And it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. The war in Ukraine has been going on for more than 4 months, and there's no sign of it ending anytime soon. Now, with G7 nations and NATO member countries vowing to continue support for Ukraine, what role will South Korea have?
And with lawmakers from Ukraine supposedly visiting South Korea this week, all eyes are on how South Korea will help the war-torn nation move forward. To get an expert's insight on the issues, we connect with Rafael Cohen, Director of the Strategy and Doctrine Program at RAND Project Air Force. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so first off, proposed visit by Ukrainian lawmakers to South Korea this week. What does this signal, or is this merely a reciprocal visit after lawmakers of South Korea's ruling People Power Party visited Kiev last month?
Great. Well, I think you can understand this visit in sort of two dimensions. There's a political logic and then there's a military logic. Let's talk about the political logic first. Since the very outset of the conflict, Ukraine has been very aggressive on the diplomatic front, garnering support for its cause. So Ukraine personally reached out to a variety of countries across Europe, across North America, Middle East, Asia as well. And I think the change in administration in South Korea presents a political opening for Ukraine to bolster its ties. So I think you can understand this visit in that dimension as well. I think you also have to understand it in terms of the military logic as well, though. As your coverage at the top of the hour suggested, Ukraine is very much fought in the midst of a very kinetic war of attrition in the eastern part of the country for Luhansk and Donetsk provinces, the Donbass. And in that light, it's because it's a war of attrition, it matters how much military equipment you get. And South Korea, as a major arms exporter, is a particularly attractive ally from Ukraine's perspective.
So when it comes to assistance, South Korea has been hesitant about supplying Ukraine with, what's called the lethal weapons, right, as opposed to the non-lethal weapons we saw with the helmets and the bulletproof vests. Do you think it's time that South Korea does in fact start supplying lethal weapons? And if they do, how do you suppose Russia will respond?
Sure. So I'm not going to answer what South Korea should do. I'll say from an American perspective, if South Korea does supply lethal munitions to Ukraine, it would be a welcome move, and in two respects. First off, as you're showing actually on television now, South Korea is a major arms exporter, particularly of artillery. So the K9, for instance, is which is a self-propelled artillery piece, one of the most sold weapons pieces across the world. It's also a producer of ammunition, both of which are in short supply for the fight in Ukraine. So in terms of sort of shifting the dynamics on the battlefield, South Korean military equipment would be quite useful. And then from a political dimension, I think as the Australian Prime Minister said in your clip earlier in the hour, the stronger the international order, and I mean the liberal democracies in the international order, present a cohesive front and push back collectively, I think we'll be stronger off for it. Now, as to the Russian response, I think it's important to know that Russia really is in pretty limited flexibility here in terms of their ability to respond. I think you might see a diplomatic response, perhaps potential travel bans, potential additional economic sanctions are directed towards South Korea if it applies military aid. But there's a limit to what Russia can do. In fact, it's just preoccupied with the fight in Ukraine, and that really limits its freedom of movement elsewhere in the world.
Well, then, one of the effects of the Ukraine war is countries wanting to join NATO. Turkey has lifted its objections to Finland and Sweden joining the alliance. So do you think Russia was blindsided by this decision, and how will this affect Russia's next moves?
Sure. So I think Putin, much like most Western military observers, on February 23rd, the day before this kicks off, didn't believe that his actions in Ukraine would cause Finland and Sweden to join NATO. In fact, I don't think he thought he would be fighting a intense war in the Donbass 4 months later. That said, I don't think Russia is particularly surprised that Finland and Sweden are joining NATO. Both of those countries have signaled that they intended to join the alliance now for several months. The leaders of those countries have told Russia directly that they were planning on doing this. So I don't think they're surprised that Finland and Sweden are actually going ahead and completing that accession process. As to what Russia can do, is again, as I mentioned earlier, there's very limited levers Russia has right now to express its displeasure. It can issue strongly worded diplomatic statements. It can threaten additional sanctions. It can perhaps undertake actions in the cyber realm. But again, Russia right now is primarily focused on Ukraine, so there's not a whole lot they can do on the military side in order to change Finland or Sweden's ultimate accession.
So let's talk about Ukraine. Ukraine has kind of long shown willingness to join the military bloc of NATO, which obviously irked Russia quite a bit. How likely is it, in your opinion, that Ukraine finally is able to obtain membership if, I guess, everything goes through as planned?
So I still think it's probably unlikely that Ukraine ultimately joins NATO, and that's for two reasons. First off, when we've talked about what sort of diplomatic settlement might come out at the conclusion of this conflict, one of the bargaining chips that has been on the table is that Ukraine would officially drop its bid to join NATO. It would still go ahead and join the EU, but not NATO. And then on the other hand, I think there are a number of members within the alliance that would still be skeptical of Ukrainian accession towards NATO, if for no other reason that they don't want to get involved directly in a military conflict with Russia. They're happy to support Ukraine by supplying weapons, by supplying humanitarian aid, diplomatic cover and the like, but they don't really want to get into a shooting war. And so I think there would be reluctance both on the Ukrainian side, as well as on a number of the NATO member states' side, to them actually joining the alliance. At the same time, though, it may not actually matter as much, because as long as this conflict goes on, Ukraine is going to be increasingly equipped with Western-style military equipment that meet the NATO standard. They're going to be trained by the West. So they'll increasingly look closer and closer to a NATO-like military, even if they're not officially in the alliance. And certainly there's going to be no love lost between them and Russia, whether or not they're in the NATO alliance or not. So again, they may not officially be in the alliance, but it may not matter that much at the end.
All right. Thank you so much for your insights. Looking forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
And with that, that's going to wrap up the first half of New Day at Arirang.
But coming up next in the second half, President Yoon taking part in his first overseas trip and his first multilateral diplomacy during the NATO Summit. What were some of the results of his trip? We find out during Global Insights, so stick around. We'll be back in just a moment.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean New Day. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
넌 볼 수 없고 가질 수 없어 똑똑히 뭘 쏟아내도 뜨거운 자태 한번 비추지 않고 내게만 가치란 그녀는 유명한 서울의 별다 어딨나 In your eye 걔와 함께면 넌 디스토피아 내 발걸음 따라오면 유토피아 나의 내
feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this
Welcome back to the second half of New Day at Arirang. South Korea and China have agreed to return the remains of Chinese troops that died during the Korean War to China in September.
That's right. This was decided during a meeting between Kim Sang-jin, the Defense Ministry's Director General of International Policy, and Lee Jing-sen, a Chinese Veterans Affairs official. The two officials met in China and decided to hold a ceremony to casket the remains on September 15th before they transport them the next day. This would be the 9th such repatriation. Since 2014, South Korea has already returned 825 sets of remains of Chinese soldiers. Now, for the first time since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of inbound and outbound international travelers here in South Korea has surpassed 1 million in the month of June. According to the Transport Ministry on Sunday, the number of international travelers surged to 1.28 million, rising 420% on year. The rise in international travelers comes as the ministry lifted related restrictions, including a curfew on flights landing at Incheon Airport from June 8th. It also plans to allow air carriers to increase number of international flights.
Just last week, President Yoon was in Spain on his first overseas trip to attend the NATO Summit as an observer. And there, the president was busy holding a number of bilateral and multilateral summits with world leaders, making known South Korea's will for global solidarity and cooperation. And for the first time in its new strategic concept, NATO described China as a challenge to its interests and security. President Yoon now has to balance his relations with the U.S. and China while dealing with North Korea's nuclear threats. Looking back on the diplomatic significance of his trip to NATO, we connect live to Chung Gu-yeon, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Gangwon National University, and Mason Ritchie, International Politics Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
All right, so to start us off, Professor Chung, what do you think were some of the key outcomes of President Yoon's trip to Madrid?
Well, it was a kind of first trip abroad since he became a president. And actually, this was a good opportunity to show South Korea's new foreign policy initiative, which is entitled as Global Pivotal States. And this was a kind of nice occasion since South Korea was invited as one of those participants of Asia Pacific partners of NATO. And it actually shows South Korea will be taking outgoing approach to international affairs, scaling up its international commitment, which distinguishes itself from the previous Moon administration. And South Korea will be on the side of value-driven diplomacy that emphasizes democracy and rule-based order in response to Ukraine crisis in particular. And other accomplishments include South Korea's policies to secure economic security, especially to diversify South Korea's supply chain to reduce its dependency on China. Another accomplishment will be its attempt to address North Korea's denuclearization. Actually, this was a kind of major priority of Yoon administration, that it wants to garner support to South Korea's diplomatic approach to put pressure on North Korea, which will be different from the previous administration also, and focus on economic sanctions and deterrence to North Korea to start a dialogue. And into that effort, South Korea needs more diplomatic support from international community. So all of these three kind of domains and three accomplishments will be a kind of big step for Yoon administration.
Now, Professor Ritchie, how has Seoul's cooperation with NATO evolved? I mean, what role will it play in supporting the Securities Pact's new strategic concept?
So South Korea's relationship with NATO goes back formally to 2005, when they became a dialogue and cooperation partner. In 2012. This was even further formalized and deepened as South Korea, along with some other countries here in the region, became what they call a global partner, or a partner across the globe. During that time period, South Korea participated in ISAF in a limited capacity in Afghanistan, so the International Security Assistance Force there, with some civil military projects, including reconstruction. Currently today, South Korea is involved with NATO in cooperation in cybersecurity, in security-related civil science projects, some counterterrorism, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. So, with respect to this NATO summit, obviously Ukraine was front and center. So that's one of the areas where South Korea, I think, will be expected by its partners in NATO to carry perhaps some increasing burden going forward, not just on sanctions and aid, on non-lethal aid and financial aid, but perhaps also possibly backfilling some weapons, lethal weapons, to some of the countries that have been providing those weapons to Ukraine. We'll see about how that looks going forward. With respect to the strategic concept, one of the major things really that NATO was looking at there was to bolster conventional deterrence and extended nuclear deterrence. South Korea isn't going to have any role to play in that, obviously, because it's not formally a NATO member and it's not covered by the Washington Treaty in that regard. However, in the larger context of the this new strategic concept that includes some Indo-Pacific nations, what we sometimes call the AP4, the Asia-Pacific 4, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, Korea will further, I think, increase its role in NATO as a partner through opening a mission in Brussels, through increasing and building out its cyber cooperation, supply chain resilience, climate change is going to come onto the screen, sharing threat perceptions, especially vis-a-vis China, and perhaps also in the future some maritime security-related cooperation as well.
All right, now, Professor Jung, China obviously wasn't happy with what went on during that NATO meeting. Now, what were your thoughts on China criticizing the Western alliance for labeling China as a systematic challenge?
Well, China already raised grievance on South Korea's attending NATO summit before Yoon administration actually depart to Spain. But as discussed earlier, actually this was discussed by the Washington. China does not have any veto over who can and who cannot be attending the summit. And South Korea's attending to NATO summit was based on its interests to, as I mentioned earlier, to implement its foreign policy initiative of global pivotal states. And all the kind of countries who are attending NATO summit was actually based on their national interest to support the rules-based orders, as mentioned by Professor. And also they are responding collectively to secure these rule-based orders and cherish the value of democracy and human rights. And also we are kind of collectively working together to secure our economic resilience vis-a-vis the current economic crisis. So based on this background, China will have to kind of understand that there is a different understanding about the world order and how the world works. Now, and especially in terms of South Korea's relationship with China, Yoon administration tries to take a more principled approach, which might be distinguish itself from the previous administration. But that does not mean that South Korea will balance against China. We are still a good economic partner. We have bilateral free trade agreement, and we need also support from China to start the dialogue with North Korea. So we are taking a different approach, but that does not mean that we are antagonizing China as a kind of same kind of neighbor in the East Asia.
Now, Professor Ritchie, though, while the U.S. is a staunch ally of South Korea, China obviously is also South Korea's largest trading partner. So following this NATO summit, I mean, how do you expect President Yoon to balance relations with Beijing and the U.S.?
Yeah, so obviously this is a really important question going forward. And at least during the campaign and to some degree during the first part of the Yoon administration until now, we've seen a relatively robust set of rhetoric as concerns the Korea-China relationship. I think that there's a sort of bubble right now where that's relatively low cost because China is dealing with COVID. It's looking towards a party Congress, which is likely going to install Xi Jinping as the paramount leader, most likely for the rest of his life. And so in between now and then, I think China's not looking for significant trouble. So it's complained some about these rhetorical steps from South Korea, and it's complained some about the relationship that's growing perhaps between South Korea and NATO and some of these Western liberal rules-based countries. But it hasn't really put the screws to Korea yet, like we saw, for instance, in 2017 with the reprisals for the installation of THAAD here. So we don't actually know the answer to this question yet about how South Korea is going to deal with China going forward once China takes a more aggressive posture. What we're already seeing, however, is that South Korea is working rhetorically to tell China that its relationship with the United States and with NATO is not anti-China. Foreign Minister Park Jin has repeated that on numerous occasions. Secondly, South Korea will be selective about where it cooperates with NATO in that regard. And will, in certain cases, I think, not take steps that will antagonize China unnecessarily, especially if there's not much value in that for South Korea. And then thirdly, South Korea is going to try to diversify its economic relationship, or continue to diversify its relationship economically with China, away from China into other nations in Southeast Asia and in Europe and other parts of the world.
Now, Professor Chung, let's talk a little bit about North Korea. I mean, obviously, North Korea was a center of the attention at that NATO meeting. So what came out in regards to North Korea, and also where does South Korea stand in all this?
Well, I believe that three countries, U.S., Japan, and South Korea, are primarily working with its deterrence and economic sanctions measures that will be imposed on North Korea. Of course, three countries are open to dialogue with North Korea to start talk about how to start denuclearizations and how to kind of draw a roadmap to that goal. But three countries seems to be agreeing with that the previous administration's approach to North Korea, which is peace initiative, has been actually not working. So in that sense, we are going back to kind of pressuring approach to North Korea to start the kind of dialogue and come to the table. And so in that sense, the three countries will more specifically talking about economic measures, especially in the UN expert panel. And also they will be discussing conducting surveillance measure over illegal ship-to-ship transfer of goods in the East Sea and East China Sea. And also joint effort to deter North Korea's missile provocations and furthering joint exercise between three countries. But the three countries will be having overlapping these interests, but bilateral relationship with Japan will be a challenge for trilateral cooperations. And South Korea also prefer to expand three countries' cooperation beyond this trilateral. So it will be a challenge to how to address this bilateral kind of long-standing bilateral challenges between Japan and South Korea.
Well, Professor Ritchie, we want to hear your perspective on that trilateral summit between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan, which took on the sidelines of the NATO summit. I mean, what was your perspective on that? And also, where do you see the bilateral relations, like Professor Chung said, of South Korea and Japan going forward?
Yes, that trilateral relationship is very important for Washington. Washington has made that clear. I can come back to that in just a second. For the bilateral relationship, I think in part we have to wait for the political calendar to clear up in Japan. In July, early July, there's going to be a House of Councilors election, so an upper house election in the Japanese Diet. And I think once that's over, we're going to see South Korea and Japan really enter into a diplomatic dance on how to improve their bilateral relations. In some sense, both sides are going to want the other side to move first. And so I think there's going to be some very sensitive discussions about how their improving relationship can be framed. Obviously, there's these history issues, whether they go back to the textbooks or Dokdo or colonial period labor exploitation. That's something that's going to have to be dealt with in one form or another, and is going to be quite tricky. At the same time, the Yoon administration has been very clear that rhetorically that it wants to deal with those historical issues simultaneously to more forward-looking issues involving cooperation bilaterally and trilaterally on North Korea sanctions and on deterrence against North Korea. And then, coming to these larger, multilateral questions, trilateral and above, as Professor Chung just mentioned, you have the possibility of South Korea cooperating as a sort of adjunct to some of these Quad working groups, notably on climate change, vaccines, technology, and supply chains. And then, looking at the military cooperation, we do see that RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific military exercises, which have just started and will go all the way into August, are very likely and are currently scheduled to include some U.S., Japan, South Korea missile defense cooperation. So I see that as one of the ways that we see the trilateral moving forward as well within a larger multilateral context.
All right then, Professor Chung, how do you evaluate South Korea's standing in the global diplomatic community as a whole?
Well, South Korea's role in the international community has been elevated as it conceived more stakes, and also based on its democratization, economic developments, and all the kind of capacity has contributed to has a much larger role of South Korea. But so far, South Korea's kind of standing in the international community has been pretty bilateral. We are cooperating with other countries and contributing to international public goods in a bilateral manner. So what South Korea, especially current Yoon administration, wants to focus is kind of multilateral approach, as I mentioned, as noticed by the term global pivotal states. We are taking more multilateral, and we have to take a more multilateral approach to international affairs, as now we are under this situation of kind of global power transitions. And to that end, we need to have more coalitions and more like-minded countries to focus on our current issues and problems. So in that sense, South Korea needs to be more active in scaling up its commitment. I think that's the direction of foreign policy of current Yoon administration. But to that end, South Korea need to put more effort to support the current existing foreign policy, international foreign policy of other countries, and of course the current unilateral and multilateral coalitions and how they are addressing this issue.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Again, that was Professor Chung Gu-yeon at Gangwon National University and Professor Mi-jin Ritchie at Hankuk University of Foreign Study. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, sustainability and ESG management are usually associated with large corporations, but in fact, public institutions and small and medium-sized companies are also looking to improve their environmental impact, social responsibility, and governance. Our Kim Bo-kyung tells us all about ESG management and how Korea is implementing it.
Broadcasting equipment can get too old as time passes by, and news networks that need to stay up to date have to replace their equipment with newer models. Arirang TV recently upgraded its cameras, lights, and mixing desks. But given that the older equipment can still be used not for broadcasting but perhaps for educational purposes, the international broadcaster decided that instead of throwing them away, it would donate the equipment as part of its ESG management.
ESG management means looking at the sustainability or ethical impact of an investment or firm based on environmental, social, and governance factors. E, for environmental sustainability. A company should do its activities to the extent which it can safeguard the environment. S, for social sustainability or responsibility. Supporting social issues in local communities and having good relationships with employees, suppliers, customers, and local communities. G for governance. Strengthening transparency and pursuing diversity in leadership while being accountable to shareholders. ESG management has become a new paradigm for sustainability, and one expert says every organization and economic unit needs to apply this.
Local governments, public institutions, nations, households, and even individuals should do ESG management. Of course, large companies need to do it as soon as possible, since if they don't, they won't be able to get overseas investment or export their products. Yet, public institutions also need to follow this trend. As large companies are hard to regulate, the government should first encourage public institutions to do ESG management.
Arirang TV put more than 200 items of broadcasting equipment up for donation. 3 public institutions wanted the items, and one of them is Hongbuk-gu District Youth Center.
Using broadcasting equipment donated by Arirang TV, a small studio has been set up in Hongbuk-gu District's Youth Center. It enables students dreaming of working in media companies to experience what it feels like to work at a news network.
We had equipment that was outdated but could still be used. In terms of recycling, we looked for institutions or organizations that would use these. Songbuk-gu office was trying to have its own broadcasting network for kids in a youth center, so we donated the items. As they weren't capable of setting up a studio, professionals from our news network helped them for 2 months.
With 99 items at the center, students can experience being in a newsroom and find out whether it's the career for them.
I'm working at the school's broadcasting system, and I want to learn how to adjust the cameras and audio.
The Youth Centre is working on lots of programs for kids and young people, and I'm happy that teens are able to learn more about a variety of jobs and careers through media-related programs held in this studio.
Not just students, but teachers at the center also become trainees paired with a team from Arirang TV.
스킨톤을 잡을 때는 프레임 안에 들고 있고
네, 벡터스코프라는 그 계측기로 스킨의 색깔이 어느 위치가 있는지를 정확히 측정하기 위해서는 얼굴이 카메라에 거의 대부분을 차지하게 잡으시면 돼요.
In the future, the broadcaster plans to keep up the training sessions, so the studio can help not just the students but the center's faculty too. This youth center is not the only venue benefiting from the second-hand gear. The National Library of Korea and National Archives of Korea also received some equipment to play old tapes and videos. It aims to use it so people can watch and listen to the roughly 70,000 visual and auditory materials at the library.
Those materials need equipment that can read them, so it is also important to have the reading systems as well. Such devices are hard to get. At this point, getting those tools is a big help.
Any equipment that does not work properly will be displayed in a museum that will be built in Pyeongchang. The National Archives of Korea is where all the document, visual, and auditory materials from public institutions goes to. It will also use the gear provided to play old videotapes and digitalize them for further preservation.
Most of the gear that was offered is for analog videos, which are not produced anymore and hard to get. We need the equipment to play recordings from the 1950s to 70s, so it'll be very helpful for us.
Public institutions and conglomerates are at the forefront of ESG management as they have the budget and capabilities that small and medium-sized companies lack.
Relatively, large companies try to do ESG management, making committees for that. Public firms are now taking baby steps while small and medium-sized ones are just crawling. They do not have the budget or personnel.
Yet some small firms are also looking at ESG, such as this athleisure clothing brand, which focuses on pursuing zero waste. Fabric that originally would have been disposed of is used to make small products like masks and hairbands. The brand also uses eco-friendly materials that are biodegradable.
보면은 일반 원단이랑 그 원단으로 만든 그 제품들이랑 상당히 같아 보이는데 이제 좀 특별한 원단으로 만들어진 제품이라는 말씀이시죠?
네, 저희가 이제 기존에 사용하고 있었던 일반적인 레깅스를 만들었었던 기본적인 원사와 원단 대비해서 이번에 쭉 검토를 하다 보니 옥수수 추출물에서 나오는 라이크라이 T400이라고 하는 원사를 저희가 활용을 하면서 한번 테스트를 해봤더니 뛰어난 원래 자체적으로 옥수수가 가지고 있는 점성을 가지고 굉장히 뛰어난 이 탄성과 그리고 내구성을 가지고 있구나라고 하는 부분을 발견을 하고 그 부분을 저희의 원단으로 개발을 해서 새롭게 출시한 라인이라고 할 수 있습니다.
Unlike nylon, which takes centuries to degrade, this biodegradable material takes only 10 years. At the same time, corn's viscosity offers flexibility that can match spandex. When it comes to cotton, they use a bio-based model fabric made from spinning beech tree cellulose. Such efforts led them to win the biggest prize at the 2022 ESG Management Innovation Awards. When asked how the staff came up with using such eco-friendly materials, the CEO said they started by making small decisions.
We thought we would have to take a big, deep breath to do it, but when I shared the issues, slowly ideas piled up. Small decisions naturally led us to use the title of doing ESG management. We were not too serious from the start, but rather trying to do what we can.
To other medium and small-sized companies, she says there is nothing to be scared of.
It is okay to let the fear go away. Starting ESG management is not too difficult. Many reasons why CEOs are scared about it is because they think there needs to be a lot of investment, and without high sales, it would be hard to bear the cost. We thought that way too, but with many other partners, industries that have already paved the way, it was possible for us without using too much money.
Well begun is half done. Though the road might seem bumpy, all firms need to start thinking about community, society, and the environment. Once that leads to the first small decisions, it can grow into something that helps make our future more sustainable. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
The K-pop girl group Blackpink have set a new record on YouTube for the most views for a video by a K-pop act. The video for their song Ddu-du Ddu-du surpassed 1.9 billion views early Sunday Korea time. The song came out in July 2018. It reached 1 billion views in November 2019. At the same time, it reached number 55 on the Billboard Hot 100, the highest ranking for a K-pop girl group until that point. On YouTube, Blackpink now have a total of 24.1 billion views for all their videos combined. Now, for a look at news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley standing by at the Arirang newsroom. Good morning to you, Matthew.
Good morning to you guys.
All right, let's start in Denmark, where several people have been killed in a shooting at a shopping mall.
Right. The attack at a shopping center in the Danish capital of Copenhagen on Sunday has left several people dead and others injured. Officials are still working to confirm the number of people killed and injured, but at least 3 people have been hospitalized. Authorities have arrested a lone gunman described as a 22-year-old ethnic Danish man. Police have not yet given any motive for the attack, but haven't ruled out terrorism. According to reports, the shooting took place at several locations within Denmark's largest mall. Danish media reported that a Harry Styles concert at the nearby Royal Arena was cancelled, with 17,000 fans already waiting inside. At least 6 hikers were killed and 8 injured after a section of ice collapsed off a mountain in the northeastern Italian Alps and tumbled down a popular hiking route. Several people are reported still missing after the avalanche on Sunday rolled down the Marmaloda, the highest mountain in the Dolomites. 5 helicopters and several teams with search dogs have been dispatched to the area, while rescued hikers have been taken to nearby hospitals. According to local experts, the avalanche came amid higher than average regional temperatures, recording above 10 degrees Celsius at the top of the glacier the day before the incident. Heavy flooding in the Australian state of New South Wales has forced thousands of residents in Sydney to evacuate. The evacuation order was given on Sunday after Australia's second or largest city experienced heavy downpours and gale force winds. According to local reports, at least 67 flood evacuation orders have been issued across the region, alongside a further 66 evacuation warnings. This comes as 3 major rivers burst their banks. The Australian Defence Force has also been dispatched to help locals get to safety. The floods come just over a year after extreme rainfall in March 2021 led to what was labelled a 1-in-100-year flood. Meanwhile, Australia's weather services predict rain will intensify over the next 2 days. Around 100,000 anime fans have been visiting the Los Angeles Convention Center for the anime industry's largest event. The annual Anime Expo event called AX has returned for the first time in person since 2019 after the pandemic saw the event go online. The 4-day expo started on July 1st and combines announcements by all the biggest studios and publishers. Organized by the Society for the Promotion of Japanese Animation, fans of the cosplay-filled event can experience interactive videos and card games.
Good morning. The first typhoon of this season, Eri, will head towards waters southeast of Jeju Island's Seogwipo this afternoon before veering toward Japan's southern island of Kyushu. The Korean peninsula will not be directly affected by the typhoon, but it will trigger more hot and moist air to the country. So a typhoon advisory has been issued in waters of Jeju, while heat alerts in place nationwide. And Seoul could have the hottest day of the season so far today. Though there is a chance of passing showers, 5 to 60 millimeters of sudden rain could fall. The south coast and Jeju will see 5 to 60 millimeters of rain, which will not help that much to relieve the heat. It was such a sweaty night we had. Many parts of the country had again a tropical night, and Seoul had a low above 26 degrees Celsius all night long. A sweltering day across Korea with high to very high UV rays in store, while heat continues until monsoon rain returns at the end of the week. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that wraps up our newscast for this hour, but we'll be back tomorrow for our Tuesday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
As always, thanks for joining us, but also stick around for more updates in our later newscast. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are, and as always, take care.